So the first idea that we actually going to talk about is really about the sustainable technology for social service. And we're actually going to start from the impact paradigm shift. I think we all understand that there is um, a ecosystem of impact investing. So basically, at the very beginning, there is, a funding, a party that actually start to, funding this entire vehicles in terms of a philanthropic funds or impact investment funds and so on, and the money actually goes to the social service agency, and then the social service agency providing services to the beneficiaries, and the beneficiary communities impact generated as what we call the return. And I mean, it can be in terms of financial return and also social return or environmental return, and basically that go back to the marketplace of impact investment. So basically, I think this diagram is actually showing like the focus of today's presentation on these three layers of technology engagement that we actually can talk about. The first one is actually more about the middle sessions. It's more about like the management of money or the management of capital or even the management of impact. So this is actually like how technologies can help us to how to say, like, to decentralize the management. So instead of having a very heavy management team, how technology can get in. The second layer, which is the bottom layer, which is about like how communities can participate, not just in terms of impact measurements, like collecting data, validating impact, and so on, but also in terms of generating more impact. So basically, we're actually going to show a bunch of cases in terms of community currency on the bottom layer, like how technology is not just about treating all the beneficiaries as data labor, but actually getting the chance for them to generate their own value. The third layer is actually the above layer, which is about financial transactions. I think there is actually a lot of new concepts recently, like I think the whole Asian social service sector has been talking about in terms of social impact bonds, pay for success models, and so on. So basically, like all this kind of conditional financing model can become a program, or basically what we call it programmable conditional finance. So basically, I think this is like the ecosystem or the big overview that we actually would like to talk to everybody in today's presentation. The problem right now that we are engaging, I think in terms of the reason why that we need this paradigm shift is not particularly just because technology is cool, but it's actually like looking for solutions from technologies so that we can actually solve the problem. And basically, these actually the other three problems that we actually understand from the market in our last 6-7 years working in this field from a technology perspective. The first one is really about lacking the trust. Like it totally become the bottleneck for program participation. Like, if I'm a funder, I want to really believe that on the ground there is actually a problem happening. If I'm on the ground, I really want to understand if I deliver XYZ service, there will be a funding coming to me and try to solve my financial problem. So basically, I think there even like trust between sector and sector. For example, if we work in a government project, so basically there will be different departments from government. There's actually already a lot of problems about sharing data among different government entities and so on. In terms of the participations, in the traditional or the mainstream way of designing social program, it's actually very labor intensive. So it's very difficult to have a large scale participatory project. And the last one is really about the data and digital divide. And it literally means like, can people actually accessing data or information or digital devices so that we can actually get high quality data, or on the other hand, the beneficiary is able to receive the right information for them to choose the right type of services for them. So basically, I think the solutions that we would like to provide here is actually also a very core part of our curriculum. is about how we can actually understand data rights. Because when we actually start to digitize everything, put everything online, there's actually a need for everybody to trust the system. So basically, it needs to be a system that everybody trusts. So basically, when everybody have their cyber identity or their cyber behavior, they actually have no worry about their data rights. The second one is about human centric, because a lot of software, hardware from the technology side of it is actually quite ready. But how can we actually decide those experience so that the beneficiaries, especially those grassroots communities, are able to engage? And the last one is about data literacy building. It's actually coming back to our program about the data divides, that how can we build the literacy of people understanding the value of data, not just in the management team, not just from the funders' perspective, but also in the beneficiaries community. Data literacy and ethics is one of the key topic we always start with, because it's actually one of the issues that a lot of organization neglect the importance of that. So basically, this is actually like a framework, like how we try to understand a program or a project or an organization for digital transformation. This is what we call Sustainable Development Readiness Index. It's actually for us to understand, the decision management, the knowledge management, and client management, and how those situations of technology implementation and the difficulties of those three dimensions. And at the end of the day, I think we always start from the last mile. So basically, this is what we call the last mile agile technology developments. We're actually particularly going to talk about the agile strategy later, but it's actually quite important for us to really designing the entire solution from the bottom up. So at the end of the day, I think the frontline engagement is not just about technology, but also about communication. Because, for example, the self-sovereignty identity, the timely needed responses, and the data literacy building is more about creating the efficacy and the foundation for the participation, for the participants to contribute data, to trust the systems, and so on. So basically, from each of these bullet points, there are very specific strategies that we decide in terms of workshops, in terms of community engagement, in terms of gamification, that we actually able to explain these big ideas to the community members. On the other hand, on the right hand side is about management. It's about like how, for example, AI and DLT, distributed ledger technology, or blockchain can actually start to create a different or more efficient workflow, a redesign for organization. It's basically like more like organization internal workflow redesign. And I think the whole idea is really about like if the database are actually secure and shareable, and also allowing people to set up different types of strategies for sharing in terms of the mandates and privacy settings and so on. How can those workflow be changed so that efficiency can be brought in? So starting from the front line, something that we really try to push is what we call a decentralized identity, a decentralized identification, or it's actually a digital wallet. But basically, you can think about like in an analog space, when everybody have your wallet, you have cash, you have your credit cards, you also have your ID, you have a lot of stuff to prove that who you are. So this frontline technology particularly is for identifications. And it's actually quite important because from the perspective of the social service agency, it's becoming the unique ID for social service agencies or organizations to identify who they are serving to. So, and at the end of the day, it's actually, for example, in Hong Kong, is actually a unique ID for all beneficiaries. So basically say, if one beneficiary is receiving services from 3 organizations, so the system at the back end can actually start to understand that the impact that generated from this one person actually need to be shared by 3 organizations. So at the end of the day, we need to avoid the problem of double counting. And basically, I also understanding like how more precisionly that we can, providing a service to this person through understanding like how many other services that he actually received. From the perspective of the beneficiaries, they're actually not just about identifying themselves for the social worker or social service agency, but also becoming tools that they can contribute data. They can, create community currencies among their own community. They can claim their identity, their assets, their abilities, and also need. Particularly about ability, is actually more about the workforce planning for the grassroots communities, like how they can receive, for example, digital certifications for really microservices that they would like to provide services to their own community. For example, like cleaning, for example, like babysitting, like those kind of very small scale abilities that they receive, and so on. So in terms of the data, so when we actually say that when all the social enterprises or SSAs and also beneficiaries are sharing some sort of common stack of data. So basically that will facilitate the unique ID and solve the problem of double counting. And for a lot of the integrated or aggregated analysis of impact, there will be a lot of a value that we generate. So basically at the end of the day, we need an impact data common. This is actually a project that we are implementing in Hong Kong. It's actually called a consortium, a impact data consortium chain in Hong Kong that the Hong Kong government, which is the Social Enterprise and Innovation Fund, is funding this infrastructure. It's actually a public infrastructure on blockchain technology for all the social service agencies and foundations, intermediaries, to actually put their data on. So basically they can start to create this unique layer of data. For example, as what I mentioned, the unique ID kind of idea. But more importantly, they start to able to share templates. They want to share impact measurement metrics. And they also want to share, for example, the benchmark of their performance. And they also want to share a lot of things with each other. For example, baseline data for RCT, randomized controlled trial experiments, and so on. So basically, it becomes a common style of data. So when I actually come up to this point, I think usually the question from the crowd is that when all the data is shared, but if I am a social service agency, I have my own mandates to keep private about my data. So basically, there is a contradiction. I think everybody really understands there is a intention of sharing, but there's also a lot of practicalities that data need to be private. And this is the reason why we actually, on this particular platform, on the one hand, we try to really advocate the concept of sharing and try to incentivize sharing. But on the other hand, also try to letting people understand data private, like the importance of data privacies and so on. So, and I will actually talk about the data ethics in the next in the next sessions. So this is about like how the system actually runs. It's actually a dashboard system for organizations to have their projects on. There's a mobile application, which is basically their ID or their identification wallet for beneficiaries to log in. So beneficiary is able to participate in all kinds of impact measurements and also validating impacts. And on the middle one is basically the analytic dashboard that you can actually start to compare your own impact with other organizations or other projects. The technologies actually try to improve the information accuracy and basically also try to what we call decentralizing the task or the workforce of impact measurements and impact validations. So basically the whole logic is that there will be a process for social worker and organization to create their project ID, and the project actually going to set up their impact measurement framework through our system called SLIM, System Library of Impact Measurements. And this measurement become what we call the contract behind the project. So basically, it's the only accountability sessions of the measurements that I think the public need to know why you're committing on these metrics, the measurements, the outcomes, and so on. And are you actually working hard towards the outcomes that you set up at the very beginning? The number 3 step is about the need verifications. It is about like how the beneficiary actually able to claim, for example, the need that they have. So basically, the social service agency can actually creating strategies, particularly tackle on the real needs on the ground. The claim, the outcome claim is actually by the social service agency or the staff of them. Basically say, oh, I deliver this amount of services and so on. And there's actually a process of verifications, which is more about the auditing of the data. And basically at the end of the day, in the database, we're actually going to have different layers of data. For example, there will be data about the projects, like the promise of the projects at the very beginning. There will be data about the need verifications. There will be data about like what kind of impact that the organization claim that they are generating. And we can also see how much those claims got verified through some sort of system. It can be a third party, it can be a verification by the beneficiary, depends on different cases. This whole process is actually really try to lower the threshold of impact measurements. But the process of creating your mandates or your impact measurement frameworks is still very professional. So basically, there's a small app that we developed within the system, which is really about a visitor or a small robot or a flow that helping social service agencies to create your own impact measurement framework, your own fear of change, your metrics, your survey, the cost, and also the impact contracts. So basically, this whole process is not really try to replace the professional service of sophisticated, impact measurement design, but really try to creating a massive, adaptation of the measurements on the system. In terms of the implementations of this whole technologies on social service agency or impact management intermediaries, I think we try to really emphasize this concept called an agile mindset. That means it's actually really working on baby steps and constantly engaging with the front lines and try to understand what is the feedback from the front line to readapt this whole design of the technology solutions. So these are the 5 steps that the agile change management that we actually work with a lot of stakeholders. You can imagine the stakeholders can be a community group, or it can be a very large-scale impact management foundations, or it can be a impact investment funds and so on. But for each of them, there might be slightly different in terms of the workshops and the process that we develop. But the 5 steps are always the same in terms of alignments, that we need to really make sure that everybody align the value that they're actually going to generate through the digital transformation. The adaptation is really about like how technologies fit into the SSA's culture, instead of everybody need to change their culture to adapt to technology. The number 3 is about agile literacy building. It's really about a process for us to workshop with the SSAs and also community members to let them understand not just about how to use the technology, but also really understand the value of information, the value of analysis, and also the ethics behind technologies and data. The number 4 is about adaptations. It's really about the paradigm shift. Can we actually redesign the new business model after the digital transformation? I think this number 4 is very important because this digital transformation is not just about creating efficiency. It's not about saving everybody time. Everybody can go home earlier. It's not about like I have 200 people company, I can fire everybody and have a 20 people team with AI. It's not about that. It's more about like how the business model can be changed. For example, I can own a taxi company or I can own a Uber. I think it's more about like how a social service agency can decide the company of Uber instead of firing all the taxi driver from the taxi company. And number 5 is about the realignment. Like after all this paradigm shifts has been happening, I think the organization need to realign with all their stakeholders, all their partners, all their beneficiaries, all their funders again. So basically, I think this entire change management process is done. As I mentioned, there are actually a lot of workshops that we're actually designing. For example, the case in Hong Kong, we actually have a 13 classes or 13 workshop, curriculum, particularly for the impact management intermediaries to go through. So basically helping them to redesign their management model and even the business model of their intermediary foundations. There will be like, for example, workshops. There will be the bottleneck to efficiency analysis about their data. There will be the technology requirement. And this technology requirement is more about like really helping them to understand the privacy of data, like how data can be private and what data need to be public. And when there's some data used to be private and right now it's public, what kind of value that it can generate. And for example, when some data used to be public, we need to really make it private because it actually, on the next stage of the development of the organization, it might be a bottleneck. For example, they're not protecting their clients' data on a encrypted base. So that means it's actually quite difficult for them to scale for the international foundation or the international organization kind of level. And then the user interface design, the prototype design, and also the pilot with small group users. I think there's actually a lot of buzzwords that we actually talking about. So basically the second half of the curriculum that we actually going to launch is going to be discussing about all this kind of next generation technology that we actually going to use in social service practices. And a lot of those technology people might feels like it's very complicated, but actually it's not. Even though a lot of people speaking about a lot of buzzwords about that. So basically the whole process of this next generation technology session is more about the demystification of those technologies for everybody. So we're actually going to show you a few cases that we're actually working on and giving you some idea like how those next generation technologies actually work in social service sectors. So the first one is really about artificial intelligence. I think it's actually a really big word. There are so many types of AIs. There are people talking about, for example, machine learning. They are talking about like a big, a discussion about the algorithms design and so on. So this particular case is really, it's actually in China. It's about poverty alleviations. But the problems that the local teams find out is that they're so difficult for them to create a measurement strategies for them to understand the poverty level of the individual families in rural China. And the reason why it's so difficult is because A, it's very costly, because they literally need to send hundreds and hundreds of surveyors to go to everybody's house to do the surveys. And number two, all these local surveyors, they basically take the job as a part-time job. So basically say when they need to go harvest in their farm, they will quit their job. So basically there's a huge budget for training. They basically need to train people every 2 months because people get in and get out. And number three, they're actually relying on a survey to collect data to understand the poverty level. It's actually quite difficult to decide a survey because when you actually talking about the poor communities, it's really difficult for you to say, hey, how much money that you're earning, like because everybody's not earning any money. So there need to be another ways that this can be measured and can be, a little bit more simple and easier at the front line. So this is actually one solution about, how we can use visual recognitions to understand the living qualities of the household, and actually start to giving a scores for individual families. And the whole base of this one's actually developed from a Grameen trust a matrix called PPI, Poverty Out of Progression Index. It's actually a measurement about like for example, how many stores of houses you have. Do you have a clay house or a brick house? Do you have a big window or small window, or you have a TV or a washing machine, and so on. So basically, it's more about measuring what you have instead of how much you earn. And this whole process is actually very, easy in terms of visual recognitions. So the local agency, for example, the local village officials, or even the household by themselves, can just take pictures of their house and send it to the cloud, and there will be the artificial intelligence in the cloud start to giving scores for the houses. So basically, for this particular one, there are 3 pictures. One is the environmental, the other one is material, the third one is interior. And basically, they can start to providing a rough idea about the living qualities of these families and so on. And this actually also lower the threshold of impact measurement, because there's zero training is needed. That you don't need to understand how to ask the 11 question or 25 question. You cannot fake the data because it's an image. There, of course, can be like data validation. Like after all this data is collected and score is given by the machine, there can be a second round of data validation. So basically, the machine learning can start to even differentiate cultural differences. For example, in these regions, clay building means poor, but in that region, clay building means rich people. I mean, the technology actually start to learn from the data model, and also the time to time, a change of the data model to actually start to adapt to the realities. And another one is really about like how data can be collected from the ground through a technology. So this is really, this image is actually a frontline solution of an early childhood education program in China that the government tried to provide, free early childhood services to all the children from 1 to 3 year old, because they basically believe that the investments on the early childhood is basically generating around 8 times returns comparing to investing to university students. So basically, there will be the frontline agents or the frontline gadgets or the tools in terms of recording, photo taking, survey taking, and all this kind of technology. But I think the most important thing is really about identifications of everybody. Like everybody actually have an anonymous ID that they're actually able to map the developments of the projects. When the project's actually getting more and more participatory, for example, the first 2 cases that we actually introduced are more on the government driven projects. But when the community try to drive project by themselves, can technology actually able to help everybody to create their own impact investment strategies? I think this is basically the next session is actually going to talk about. This picture is actually a town hall meeting in Myanmar that this local citizens are voting for development of a playgrounds in their village or in their neighborhoods. And this actually a process of voting that they need to vote. Do they need a playground, or do they need a public toilet, or do they need any kind of other service, because they only have a certain amount of budgets. And also they want to make decisions about what kind of funding, like how much money that they want to spend on it, what kind of metrics that they want to use to basically say the project is successful or not. So this actually setting up the mandate of the project. The playground budget is like $2,000 only. And this voting actually going to take 1 day, and everybody actually having their identification wallet or the digital identification, and basically they are voting based on their digital identification. So nobody can change the results of the voting. But more interestingly, I think the program from the bottom, for example, the building of this playground is actually a pay for success model that the government's going to pay the money after the playground is done and after all those milestones set up by the communities has been achieved. So the community is actually putting down their own money first to actually start building the playgrounds. And after they finish the playgrounds, if they actually achieve all the milestones or even over delivering the development, the social development programs, the government, eventually also going to pay the interest for pay extra maybe 5 to 10%, to the original budgets of the project. So basically, technically speaking, is what we call an impact bond, a social impact bond. And this social impact bond is based on the voting, is based on the digital certificates that we're actually talking about. And it's also based on the digital contracts that's signed by everybody that, we actually agree on developing this, putting on our money, and there will be a milestone and the payback is this and this and this. So basically it's actually all run on a digital place. But what you can see here is actually a combination between analog certificates and digital certificate. Because in terms of the design of a lot of our cases, we actually able to decide 100% analog or 100% digital or something in between, based on the case in case. I will share more cases later on. The very last sessions about how we would like to even push the social service into more participatory role through crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, and at the end of the day, crowd economy, is more about how social service agencies, not just as a simple service provider, but actually become a platform for communities to generate services and mutually supporting each other by themselves. So I think there is a very big difference or a very big developments from the last 5 to 10 years in terms of social service developments, from purely service procurement. Basically say the government say, oh, there is 100 old people and these old people need medical help. So there will be an NGO or social enterprise say, we can deliver those medical support to these old people. And the government say, great, then I will just procure your service, giving you, for example, a grant or a loan or a bond or investment so that you can deliver this service to old people. Basically, that model is what we call a service procurement model. In Hong Kong, there's actually a very fast development of setting up platforms. So for example, there's a fund in Hong Kong called Community Investments and Inclusion Fund, also a fund by the welfare departments of the government. And what they actually try to encourage is crowd economy. It's about you are basically receiving funding from governments to create a community economy or community finance model so the communities can actually help themselves. And this actually started to touch a lot of very different models of community development or community economies. And we're actually going to show you a few cases. But this is actually a spectrum of cases that we have been working on in the last 5 years in different countries and cultures. All the way from the right-hand side called P2P trade or last mile exchange, which you can I think a lot of people have heard about time bank. So basically, time bank is actually using time as a ledger for the bartering system. That I know how to cut hair, and you create some sort of for example, some craftsmanship. So I can use my a haircut to a service to exchange your product, but we actually exchange through the value of time. So basically, that's one of the typical case of the P2P trade, the last mile exchange. The second one is about the lending, the P2P lending, which is about the Grameen Bank, how communities or a credit union can start helping themselves P2P future is what we call a production co-op, and we're actually going to show you some cases in the real curriculum. This is about like, you know, if I'm a farm, or if I own a factory production mass, and I got the local participant, like the local community members to work in my factory for the mass. So basically, at the end of the day, I'm not paying everybody with money, but I'm eventually paying everybody with mass. So basically, I think that's basically the peer-to-peer future idea. There is a particular project in Hong Kong that we are working on. It's about rooftop farming for the old district, the old buildings in Hong Kong, that people or local community can set up rooftop farms to generate that productivity. The direct transfer is between governments or and private sector. Is about like, you know, how philanthropy can, you know, use technologies to generate like direct transfer. For example, there's a project in Hong Kong. It's about like you know, giving people money when they get out from prison for 2 months, so that they can at least go to supermarkets and go to restaurants to have food for 2 months before they find a job. So basically, this direct transfer is actually a tokenized or a voucher model, that they're not receiving real cash for the voucher, that they only able to go to designated place to receive their service, and eventually the NGOs or the social enterprises or the even local restaurants can reimburse their tokens for the direct transfer. Community debt is what I just mentioned about the social impact bond, that community creating a debt that everybody put in their own money, and eventually either a philanthropic foundation or governments pay back everybody. Conditional finance become more like the impact investments, and at the end of it is really the private-public partnership, which is about a civic finance. I'm actually going to show you only one case about the first one, which is the last mile exchange, and maybe a little bit about the peer-to-peer future. And we'll actually share the rest of that in the real, in the big curriculum. So basically, this case just giving you a sense about how social service agencies are actually able to decentralize their services into microservices. This is a case of Time Bank. It's what we call Time Bank Classic. It's actually by a foundation in Hong Kong called St. James Settlement. They are one of the biggest foundations in Hong Kong. They have a huge amount of services, I think particularly about the homeless, and also the services to very low income families. So the book that you see here is actually a ledger of their so-called time bank. For example, if you're homeless, if you're from a low income family, basically the foundation or the St. James having a lot of stores and their partners that they can take your time to buy their service or to buy their secondhand products. And the time that people got is basically from they serve, for example, volunteer work in the foundations, or even mutually helping their neighbors and so on. So it become a closed economy or a closed economic system. So instead of St. James Settlement deliver, say, 1,000 types of social service, the community actually having a liquidities of the time voucher to help each other, which is backed by St. James Settlement's programs, and also their products that they basically deliver to everybody. And the product can be very simple. It can be a lot of secondhand products, or it can be a donation from CSR, for example, soaps, oyster oil, books, for example, like school vouchers, like all those kind of things, which are backing the economies on the ground that communities can helping each other. And this is actually what we have been piloting with them about, like creating a time band digital. You know, this is basically a guasa, right? That's it is a massage that this lady is receiving from another neighbors. But in terms of the payment, she's actually paying through an app. So this actually allowed the next step of the decentralization, because only the St. James Settlement Foundation have the book from the beginning. So this is basically everybody's ledger. like everybody, like who has how much money, who pay how much to who, and so on. So this one cannot facilitate any kind of peer-to-peer because there's no book between everybody's ledger when they're not doing the transactions in the store. But once there is a digitization, they're actually, I mean, the first step is really trying to allow the peer-to-peer transactions because the book is on the cloud right now. It's actually not a physical book, a book in the store. The next step is really about like after there is the peer-to-peer community, there will be what we call a digital marketplace, which is all the people able to put up their needs and all the people basically putting out all their services or the products. There is a process according to the mandates of different organizations. There is a process for organization to validate the needs or to validate the products or the services that people have. So for example, I know how to do haircuts or I know how to do massage. So basically there need to be a validation of the skill set. It cannot be, you know, just everybody claim anything about it. So basically when I mention about the digital identification or the wallet, there is one thing called ability, and there is actually a skill set, a category of that people can either go learn about it or receiving certificate about that. So basically all those systems start to integrate it and become this credit or the trust system within the communities. And the marketplace start to match the need and have. So it depends on the design of the technologies or the user experience. There can be only needs. Say everybody is just calling for other people to help them, or they can have just a marketplace of what I have, and people approach to those people about what they have, or they can be need and have, and people can choose both sides of it. So it really depends on the budget, and it also depends on, you know, how to decide the whole process of it. Another case that we actually want to talk about is the social housing service co-op. It's actually a particular type of social housing in Hong Kong. It's not the public housing. It's actually a transitional housing. The government is building for those people to stay here for around like 2 to 3 years, so that they can wait to go into the public housing. And this is actually one of the new house, the new housing that they built through containers. So the container housing only going to be on the site for 5 years, and they basically return the land back to the developer. And this is like a 300 household community. So based on the original service co-op, what is slightly different or something that we can add on that is basically what we call a social service tokens or a social service voucher. So there are, you know, the technology actually able to create multiple community currencies within this community. So basically, for example, there is one type of communities within the community called the peer-to-peer voucher, but there is 10% of the families are, families with children from 1 to 4 years old. So the social service agency actually able to give them another tokens or another voucher, which is a social service voucher for them to approach other service providers. And this other service provider can be, for example, NGOs, NPOs for special educations, or even like local stores, for example, local restaurants, local hardware stores, and so on. So basically, it's become a pay for success model that if there's a real need, for example, I have a children with autistic spectrum, that the social worker can refer me to go to a specific government or even like a social enterprises with a voucher. And after I see the counselor, the government can actually pay back the social enterprises. It can even be, for example, restaurants and so on. So this entire process actually try to outsource a lot of the so-called community management to local business. So instead of building a huge, like for example, like a huge dining hall inside the housing, run by the government, and or some really big operator, they can actually rely on a network of local stores that providing the same amount of service to the people, but even eventually saving a lot of cost because they can actually save a lot of space and provide more housing to the people. So basically, I think there, in this project, a lot of social housing or renovation of the old building, the Tonglao type of housing in Hong Kong, which is like the tenement housing from maybe like 70 years ago. They basically renovate those housings for the traditional housing. So the living space is actually very, very limited. So basically, for this particular type of housing service co-op, they also creating a lending library for all the neighborhoods to share, to share books, to share tools, to share rice cookers, to share coffee machines. Because if everybody have their own set of stuff, there's really not enough space for everybody to put like for example, everybody got a rice cooker, or maybe this whole flat, which the government subdivided into maybe 5 different families. They can actually share 2 rice cooker or some tools. They basically eventually saving a lot of space. So basically, this is actually like how this peer-to-peer community microservices extended into even like a lending library and also the external services and so on. And as what I mentioned is extended into the SPOs, the NGOs, local business partner. But more importantly, it's really about creating the upward mobilities in the community. So instead of just providing a housing for them for the next, for example, 3 years, they actually want everybody to get a job. They want everybody to start their own small business. So basically, they can escape from poverty instead of always stuck in the poverty problem. So basically, the pro bono professional service is really a support that this whole program linked to a CSR and try to provide like professional service, for example, accountants, or for example, like business consultants for local community members to start their own business or even go to schools and so on. So there is actually a program from the government, which is a Pay for Success Fund. It's actually also the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation Fund under the Innovation Bureau of Government. Basically, the fund is actually very keen on the Pay for Success model. So basically, say if this entire community are able to generate more degrees from community member, higher wages, or even like local business that this community member can launch, the government actually going to pay back for all the pro bono service, the social service, and also local business partner, like all their costs for that. So basically, it become an outcome procurement fund from the governments to really back this kind of upward mobility program in Hong Kong. And of course, I think the pro bono service and also the CSR volunteerism, basically there's a huge amount of corporations or staff in the corporation, they're very willing to do volunteer work. They can actually become the network of this professional service a network. And at the end of the day, the government is also considered, or like all these corporations actually have their own mechanism. In Hong Kong, they call it the Sector 88, which is actually a tax redeemable a mechanism to redeem tax from this volunteer workers. But with the blockchain credits or the blockchain accounts, basically that become a very legitimate record for them to prove the volunteer work that they provide on this decentralized social service platform. And at the end of the day, when the data of all this milestone got achieved and the data actually back to the government Pay for Success Fund, the risk taker or the investors can actually get their bond repayments. And the government of Hong Kong recently launched one around 30 million Hong Kong dollars, something like 6 million Singaporean dollars for Osborne to actually start, a Pay for Success model on education, on the minority student education. And basically, there is a huge desire from government in Hong Kong to move all the government grants from just providing a grants into a pay for success model, because they definitely want a lot of private sector to participate in social developments. And the government can eventually more taking care of the outcome measurements instead of really worrying too much about designing the program, because they believe the private sector, the social enterprises sector, are more or way more smarter or more incentivized to actually develop the model for social services. I think this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Let's see if there's any questions.